here. So my name is Dan Wicklund. I'm the CEO of our organization called the Transition Accelerator. Welcome to today's webinar. We thought that what we needed in Canada was a strategic series of webinars, was really a go-to place where people could talk about the most interesting and important and strategic issues around the concept of transition to a profitable, fair, prosperous net zero world. So we titled the webinar series Net Zero Changes Everything. That's going to be the overarching frame for our whole webinar series. We're going to schedule them regularly so they're easier for people to come to. So we've landed on that the webinars will be the last Wednesday of every month from 1 to 2 o'clock Eastern. And the best way to stay on top of what the next topics are and so on is to follow us on social media. And we're going to put how to do that into our chat. Or you could also email us at info@transitionaccelerator.ca to be added to our mailing list. So for a run of show for today's webinar, I'm going to introduce our guests, or they're going to introduce themselves. I'm going to give a very short 10-minute presentation about the Transition Accelerator methodology and why we think net zero changes everything. That's the frame for the series, and that's the frame for today. Then we're going to go to our panelists for, frankly, some questions that we think are really important to be asked and answered on the front end of the webinar. And then we're going to go to the audience for questions as well. So please put your questions into the Q&A part of the platform here. Go ahead and chat, but please put your questions into the Q&A part of the platform. And remember to vote the questions up. And we're going to try to reserve about half of our time of this hour for audience questions. We really want this to be an interaction rather than some pontification. Okay, so what I'm going to do now is turn to our two panelists. First, Dr. Normand Mousseau to introduce himself. Normand.
Hi, I'm glad to be here today. I'm Normand Mousseau, you've heard that. I'm a professor of physics at University of Montreal. I'm also the scientific director of the Trottier Energy Institute at Polytechnique Montréal, which has a mandate to support energy transition. I'm also co-founder of the Transition Accelerator, and I'm quite involved in modeling. So we drove the energy modeling initiative for a few years, and now we're moving in the next step of this initiative to support modeling and how models can be used for supporting policies.
And second panelist, Dr. James Meadowcroft.
Hi, yeah, I'm James Meadowcroft. I'm a professor in the School of Public Policy at Carleton University, where I work on all things connected with the transition to net zero. And for a long time, my research has been on governance for sustainable development, and particularly transitions in what we call large socio-technical systems, but really are the way that we've had major advances. Think about the electrification of society or the invention of automobility at the beginning of the 20th century and so on. And I'm also one of the founders of the Transition Accelerator.
Okay, great. I'll just flag that we have 4 research directors at the Transition Accelerator: Normand, James, but also Dave Lazell and Bentley Allen. They're just not on the panel here today. I'm also going to just note that someone put into the chat they don't hear me well. I think I was being heard quite well in our prep, but we will try to get on top of that. And Jess, let me know if it's not good enough to carry on. We'll figure that out. Okay, so I'm going to share my screen here now, and I'm going to set the stage for our talk here today. Let's see if I can do this myself. It'd be a miracle. Whoops, I need to go up. There we go. Okay, a little advertisement for the accelerator. Come on, you have to bear with us on this one. So we're a new organization. We've been around for 3 years. We work right across the country. Today's webinar is in English, but we are a bilingual organization, and we do work in Quebec as well. We're also a charity. So what we do is we work with groups across the country to build pathways to desirable futures. We think, frankly, too much emphasis is put on building pathways just to a net zero future. If we really want people to lean into change and be part of leading into a new future, they have to be reasoned other than emissions reduction to get them to do that. So we want to mix in this idea of creating a better future, one that's profitable, one that's kinder, one that's more functional, one that's more enjoyable, and that happens to be net zero. So this is really the Transition Accelerator methodology. And we actually have a formal methodology. I'm not going to go into it, but if you take a look at the document that's on the right-hand side of our screen, we call this a tome. It's the foundational document that our 4 research directors, 3, wrote originally to set the frame for what this new organization was going to do and how we were going to approach our business. But it's on our website. Please feel free at your leisure to download it and take a look at it. It's how we think and it's why we're here. So really what we want to do is apply our new methodology that's based on transition science, the science of change and transition, and really bring analysis and practicality to what had been sort of academic and emotional debates. Fair enough. That's the end of the commercial. Okay, I've got 3 slides here. They're actually pretty dense, but I'm going to talk through them in a sequential way for about 9 or 10 minutes to set the frame. So the topic of our webinar series, Net Zero Changes Everything, is very deliberate. We think that driving to net zero is not the same thing as what we were going to do to reduce emissions for a long time, only doing things better or quicker. There's fundamental differences between an emissions reduction paradigm that we've been in since the UNFCCC was signed in 1992. So there's a fundamental difference between an emissions reduction paradigm and what you have to do to reduce emissions compared to the current emissions elimination paradigm that we're in now in a net zero definition, of course. So I'm going to walk through what we think are some of the fundamental difference between a reduction paradigm and an elimination paradigm, because net zero changes everything. And look, I'll flag, this is a summary of some of the things that we give in our day-long Net Zero Changes Everything course that we've given to many parts of the Government of Canada, many provinces and territories, and many private industrial or NGO partners already. And you can get information about that on our website as well, if you wish. So I've already broken my word. I said I wouldn't do another advertisement, but I've done that, fellas. Anyway, that is what it is. Okay, reduction paradigm. This is what we've been in for decades and decades. And what you have on your screen here is the list on the left are some of the questions and issues that dominated the emissions reduction paradigm. Questions like, is climate change real? Questions like, is climate change caused by humans? It's an anthropogenic. Questions like how important will these effects be? Should we worry about this? Is it worth acting to reduce emissions to address climate change? And of course, now in the eliminations paradigm, there's no more debate. The answer is it's real, it's anthropogenic. The effects will be remarkably important. It will fundamentally change how future generations live in terms of their ability to support themselves in an economy, which cascade into things like security concerns. So of course it's worth acting. Fair enough. Those are the easy parts. Other things that people thought about in an emissions reduction paradigm was this notion of a reduction aspiration was sufficient. It somehow was okay to come out as a government or a company or an individual to say, like, I agree that we really need to do something, and I aspire to being part of this transition to net zero. That, of course, is not even table stakes anymore. In order to be in an emissions elimination paradigm, governments, corporations, jurisdictions have to have elimination, actual plans. And almost certainly these plans will be required to be vetted by independent third-party experts very quickly. So this isn't about believing, it's now about acting. Fair enough. That's the easy part. Okay, here are 5 points now. They're somewhat interrelated. Again, emissions reduction paradigm. The reality was there's many options to reduce emissions. Because the issue is that none of the underlying systems of energy, of transportation, of buildings, of agriculture, none of the other underlying systems have to change at all. We just had to, in an emissions reduction paradigm, make them more efficient. You make a system more efficient, you reduce emissions. And we had these remarkable suite of options. So we could have said, several years ago, we're going to leave sectors A, B, C alone because it's difficult to reduce their emissions, it's expensive, and we're going to get all of our Canadian emissions reductions from sectors D, E, and F. We had that remarkable optionality. We've lost that now. To get to zero emissions, net zero, we have to get every sector to get to zero, because and what that means is that the underlying systems have to change. Quick example, you go back 5 years ago, it was actually sufficient for us to come up with a clean fuel standard to reduce the carbon intensity of fossil fuels burned inside of internal combustion engines. That was sufficient. No underlying system change. Internal combustion engine was quite reasonable to keep around. But now we need a fundamental system change. We actually have to get rid of the internal combustion engine, and you see that around the world with the zero emission vehicle mandates. No more internal combustion engines. Fair enough. Incremental change was sufficient in emissions reduction paradigm. The systems could stay the same. Incremental changes of those systems was fine. But a key issue here is that it's really difficult to believe and understand that if we take incremental changes from our current systems, that we're actually going to end up with net zero systems, fundamentally retooled systems. Let me show you one slide here about the problem with incremental change, and that's the concept of a dead end. In these two cartoons, and Dave Lazell actually made these figures. Both of these mountains denote emissions reductions. The one on the left is the concept of a dead end. So it might feel really good in the short term to start reducing emissions with an investment or a platform or a policy. But at some point, if that investment or platform or change leads to a point where you can no longer reduce emissions anymore, and you're stuck with a technology platform that is incapable of being part of a net zero society, then you've invested an awful lot of money and you've wasted time. So we call that a dead end. So the idea is, how can we come up with capable, credible pathways that are actually true pathways to get to our actual target, which is net zero in 2050. An example, liquefied natural gas for heavy duty vehicles. Might get into that. Two more points. In an emissions reduction paradigm, the economic arguments dominate. It was all about cost. But what we know now is that every scrap of analysis, certainly that I've seen, is that the cost of inacting is actually going to cost us more, even financially, than the cost of acting. So even though the sticker shock of the cost of acting might be large now, if we don't act, we're actually going to end up paying more over the long term. And then this last point here is this notion of tools. So the tools that we have used in an emissions reduction paradigm to understand and assess and act on risk, how we're being incented to change, but even modeling and analysis and data collection and reporting were developed inside of a reduction paradigm, and many of them actually might not be sufficient to support this fundamental conceptual change about emissions elimination paradigm compared to reduction. So, actually do one more slide. This sets up, this slide's complicated, don't worry about the details, but this just really puts a point on this notion of, if you take all of those differences between reduction paradigm and elimination paradigm and sort of throw them into the pot and mix it up, what does it mean? We think it means is that we cannot change our existing systems incrementally and hope to all of a sudden wake up with functional, profitable net zero systems. What that means is we have to start in the future, define what those systems need to look like, and then build pathways to them. So just what would that look like? This wheel on the left is our current energy system carriers. Details don't matter, but it's real data from NRCan, dominated by fossil fuels, lots of electricity, some biomass. And are we really going to emerge with the future energy system that's functional, profitable, and net zero if we make incremental changes to this system? We think no. So the implication is start in the future, define what the future system needs to look like, and build a pathway to it. Look, we took a crack at this. It's going to be wrong. There's no way that you can predict with any complete certainty about what a future system is going to look like. But there is remarkable global consensus about what the big pieces are going to be. And a likely future energy system that's net zero looks something like this: massive electrification. We know that. But you can't electrify everything, so we'll use hydrogen as a carrier. That hydrogen could be made from electricity or could be made from fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage. There will likely still be some fossil fuels with carbon capture and storage, and there will almost certainly be biomass as well. So we're fully aware of the implications of this new framing around starting in the system, starting in the future, building a pathway to it. and that draws on this analysis of difference between emissions reduction and emissions elimination paradigm. But the whole point of this webinar series and this webinar is to start to untangle and talk about the implications of this new frame and what we can do about it. So I'm going to take a breath. I'm conscious I've talked extremely fast, and I'm now going to ask each of our panelists a couple of questions just to get the conversation going. Please keep putting questions into the Q&A and keep voting. We've got some there. Okay, the first question here is for Normand, Dr. Mousseau. One of the fundamental tenets of a net zero changes everything paradigm is that it doesn't seem possible to suddenly achieve functional net zero systems like energy, transportation, buildings by incrementally changing our current systems. So again, we need to start in the future and build pathways to them. But when we start to, again, scratch into what did that mean? It means
your sheets of paper are making noise on your microphone.
Sorry about that. It means fundamentally different roles for government, or for players, private sector, and so on. So can you sort of muse on or unpack that notion of like how would we go about operationalizing this new paradigm, starting in the future and building pathways to it? Or another way of saying that is, aren't we sort of at risk of bridging into this language that people seem to hate, which is governments can't and shouldn't pick winners and losers? So over to you.
Thanks. You might want to cut your share of the screen sharing. So yeah. Indeed, I think that's clearly an issue that going forward will need major investments, and will need somehow to lock on some solutions. So clearly you don't want to block at the very fine level what you need to do to change the world and get to net zero. So you don't want to over specify, but you need to give the strong directions, and you need to do this by regulation and by supporting, by subsidies and all this, some action to decarbonize and going to net zero. So by imposing that the final view is net zero, I think that already constrains a lot what can be done. And by living in this kind of reduced bubble in some way that gets you to net zero, you will need to decide which investment you make. We have only 30 years to get to net zero. So that means we need to start making decisions, and these decisions, be it in terms of public transportation, being of the position or the role of individual transportation or some technologies, you have to support some and leave some on the side, but be ready to change if it happens to be a mistake. But I think we need to choose at one point. And just hoping that by throwing money at random and hoping that somehow the leverage will be done on the time scale we need, is not possible.
James, any musings on that?
Yeah, just to add that if we think of many of the major technologies we have today, or the energy system, many of these things were built out with government support, a government decision to support particular technological options. Think of nuclear power, but it's true also of the oil sands and the oil and gas industry in Alberta and Western Canada more generally. The build out of the electricity system. For all of these things, government had to decide, this is important for our national development, for our energy future, and invested in those technologies. And that's the same with many of the large-scale technologies related to decarbonization. In order to reduce uncertainty, at a certain point when things become clear, it's necessary for public investment to support them. Of course, we don't want a system where, like the brother-in-law, government supports company X because the brother-in-law of the ministries on the board of directors. So we don't want picking winners that way, but we do want commitments to the major technologies that will be needed for decarbonization.
And you have to do it, and also in a way that builds up innovation. I mean, if you say we want to decarbonize building, you don't want to say that's the technology we'll retain, but you have to put the regulation, the transformation that will facilitate also the private investments in the right direction and taking the risks.
Okay, James, look, I've got one for you here, and this is notions of transition. And can we can we learn anything about how transitions have happened in the past? One of the reasons we launched the Transition Accelerator, frankly, is because we thought we were incompletely tapping into the really smart people that are change management professionals, and they understand how people make decisions and the psychology of decision making. But you're an expert on this notion of past transitions. Any musings on what we can learn?
So yeah, as you kind of suggest, Dan, over the last 20 years, there's been development of a whole branch of study that looks how change takes place in some of these big societal systems like agri-food or the electricity system or the way we move people, goods and services and so on. And a whole, so think about the change from sailing ships to steamships, or from horse-drawn transport to the automobile, or the electrification of society. So studying these changes, we can see a whole series of features of them, which I'll mention a few, but I'm not going to explain them all, but they're multidimensional and multi-actor. It's not about one invention, it's about changes to business practices, technology, social attitudes, and so on. They involve decline as well as innovation. They're pretty uncertain and messy. They involve distinct stages. They're almost always guided by some kind of vision of a better future, because at the beginning, the new technology or approach is kind of clunky, and you need to mobilize investment to get to that better world. They all involve distribution. They're winners and losers, and governments, states play an important role. So if we think about some of these things in relation to climate change, what we can see is that getting to net zero will involve changes in a whole bunch of systems. How we move people, the urban environment and buildings, agri-food. So if you think about a couple of these things, the consequences are, firstly, that we're thinking about many transitions, not one. We often talk about moving to net zero or the energy transition, but really we need transition in all these end user sectors. So flowing from that almost immediately is the idea that you're going to need multiple policy instruments and multiple kind of policy should really focus on sectors and regions, and not so much just the economy in general, though of course everything's connected together, because the barriers and enablers in these different sectors are different. So dealing with the electricity system is just different than changing agri-food, or different than the built environment. So we need to think of policy in those terms. I guess just to add one or two other things. One is that these transitions that are occurring are being driven by multiple factors, not just the climate thing. So think about transport. Many things are changing there, different attitudes of young people to cars, the potential of autonomous vehicles. So really, if you're thinking about accelerating transition, you need to integrate those broader changes with your climate change initiatives. And the last thing I'll just say, if we think about the phasing of transitions, some sectors are quite ripe for change right now, like the electricity system. We know how to make low carbon electricity. Light duty vehicles, for instance, we have EVs. The policies that you apply there for mass rollout are different than in other sectors like air travel or agri-food, where it's not quite so clear yet what we have as broad-based solutions.
And if I would say also one point is that most of these transformations are not driven by massive movements from citizens going on the streets every week. So you cannot wait for this to happen. I mean, what has to happen at one point, also governments or institutions taking the lead and moving things forward. Whether it was when the suburbs were built and all type of transformation that happened over the year, it's not because you have citizens in the street every morning or every week to do these transformation. It's because people who are in power decide that we need to move this way, and they transform the message, they mobilize the population, but also industry and other sectors. So it's not, you cannot have these deep transformation which are fully grassroots based. You have to come from the top.
Okay, gents, we're going off script. I've taken a look at the chat and the Q's and A's. And remember, keep putting your Q's and your questions into the Q's and A's and keep voting. But I'm going to try to thread together a couple of comments and questions and come back to you. Before I do that, 2 clarifications. I understand people can hear me, so that is a good thing. And we will circulate the slides. So we'll find out a way to make sure that participants can get that. We'll probably post it on the website or something. But you do not have to madly take notes. We will have a recording of this available, and you'll have the actual slide deck available. So. Okay, there's a couple of notions here, both in chat and questions, about sort of the role of people making decisions and behavior. And you know, we did read very recently, I think it was in the Times or maybe it's the Wall Street Journal, a pretty prominent commentator wrote an article that said, you know, look, oil and gas is dominant in our society. People love using it. They're not going to change. We should sort of give up on 2050 as a realistic time frame to get off of oil and gas as an emitting resource. Any thoughts on that? The concept of human behavior and how realistic this transition is?
So, I mean, this was an article, an interview with Václav Smil, that was the big thinker in energy in Canada and the world. And his point is, it's tough to make this transformation, and oil and gas is deeply ingrained in our services, the way we use the way the society works today. So it's clearly a challenge to do this transition. I mean, if it were easy, it would be done. So it's not because it's simple, but the other side is to say, if we don't push ourselves, it's not happening. If you go around in the world, you see that people who've embarked on this transformation are moving forward. They've been moving already for 15, 20, 30 years, and they have not reached net zero anywhere. So that's a tough proposition. At the same time, I think we need to have this target to get people moving. For example, if you look at the EV, the electric vehicle, I mean, all these constraints, all these regulation that says we will have to be 100% EV in 2035, 2040, or whatever, all this is making EV a reality that brings in the technology, brings in the investments that will make this the reality of 2035. So the future is not happening. It is built upon what we decide today and how we project ourselves. So that's also part of how we get there.
James, any thoughts?
Yeah, I'd just like to emphasize, firstly, the point that Norma made, that this is really hard. I think it really is hard. And it's not just that we're dependent on fossil fuels for so many things, but also the materials that are the foundation of industrial civilization. Think about cement and steel, concrete. They have carbon emissions. And also agriculture, that's the foundation for basically feeding the world's population. Particularly forest clearances, animal agriculture, nitrogen fertilizers also are heavy greenhouse gas emitters. So the whole foundations, in a way, of our civilization are intertwined with not just fossil fuels, but other emitting processes. So it's a big deal. But on the other hand, let me say that if you look at the history of transitions, and you look at particular sectors and particular regions, there are plenty of examples of transitions taking place relatively fast. For example, the United States, basically it took 30 years to roll out the automobility transition from the time that the internal combustion engine and so on were perfected. It went on in the following decades, but huge transformation took place in just a few decades. We could roll out electric vehicles in most of the developed countries, on a couple of decade time frame to complete transition of abolition of the use of fossil fuels for certainly light and medium duty vehicles. Heavy duty vehicles are a bit more of a challenge. The same in the built environment. Over a couple of decades time span, we could drive natural gas largely out of the building sector. So when you attack it in terms of major sectors and regions, you begin to see that these time frames are not completely invented or pipe dreams. But what it means is you focus policy on the mass rollout on the areas where you have the technology, and you really roll it out. And if I'll pick another thing, the rate at which nuclear power plants were built in the United States during the rollout phase in the 60s is not, that was done. And the kind of timeframes that we're talking about for this are quite comparable. And of course, that leaves you, other sectors, and you need to get to them. But there's no point tearing our hair out about aviation fuel. That's a couple of % of Canadian emissions at the present time today. Let's attack that with other policy measures and other things, with innovation, with technological advance, and so on, and really attack the things we can do now and focus on them. Driving oil, gasoline, and diesel out of the light and medium duty vehicle. That's realizable. We can do it now, and it will change the political and economic situation over the next 15 years as it's done.
And I would say what James is saying also is that it's not only a question of talking about net zero or talking about targets. The main point is to get things moving and to start this transformation rolling. I mean, this transformation is also self-realizing, but it's also it's easier as you move forward. As you know that your neighbor has done this transformation, as you know that this industry has moved into this technology with success, the other will follow. So we have to stop talking about these goals at one point and start rolling and start making these transformations. And then we can always adjust the goals if we realize it's too fast, too slow. But the first thing is we have to start moving, and we haven't done any significant motion, I would say, in Canada, in spite of 30 years of discussions.
And one last thing, all these technologies, if you look at them, have this famous S-curve. Not much seems to be happening for a long time as research, as this trial, experiment, and then adoption can occur quite rapidly. And electric vehicles are just on the cusp of that acceleration today. And Norway's already got 60% penetration of battery electric, and even more if you count hybrids. So it's doable in a developed country.
Norman, let me pick up, again, completely off script here, but let me pick up on one of your comments there, was the notion of Canada hasn't done anything. Fair enough. But what about the emissions reduction plan? That's the legal plan that under the Canadian Net Zero Emissions Accountability Act, the federal government has to put a plan into the public domain regularly that is a transparent plan that will show Canadians how the country will drive to now legally mandated 5-year emissions reduction targets, which now is our 2030 target. So the first emission reduction plan came into the public domain at the end of March. But I mean, we have a plan now, Normand, though.
No, we don't have a plan. I mean, our modeling, we've published Canadian Energy Outlook last fall. We've done a number of modeling and analysis built on this and comparing what's happening at the Environment Canada. And our analysis of this plan is it's not a plan, it's a series of measures, a lot of money being spent, but the traction and the leverage to make this transformation is not there. So it's not something that is, I would say, structural changes. You do a lot of small bits. For example, I'll just mention also one issue. For example, to decarbonize building by 25% that is forecast in the span over 8 years. All this decarbonization in the building sector is built on energy efficiency. To get 25% reduction, it means you have to refurbish half the buildings in Canada, which is just impossible given the lack of manpower and women power. There's not enough people to do the work. So this is not a plan in the sense that a lot of the measures are not aligned with reality of being structured. And also it doesn't bring in the structural and deep transformation that can make this irreversible. So I spent some money to change my furnace to a better furnace. Next time I will want to change my furnace, if I don't get money, where will I do? So you're not doing this deep transformation. So our analysis is that this plan doesn't get us anywhere to even 20% reduction. So we need much more structuring. And that was the message in some way of the Commissioner for Environment yesterday.
So to soften Normand's message just a bit, because it's always a bit harsh, I would say that, on one hand, that plan is an incredible step forward if you think about everything Canada has done to this point. So that's the good point. They're actually, the government has put forward some kind of impressive ambition and got down to the sectoral level. But I guess when we talk about a plan, we mean more than like a framework of objectives and a series of spend. We kind of mean what are all the changes that you would need to make to achieve something? And that idea is what we talk about transition pathway that the accelerator talks about a lot. And that means looking at changes of business model, investment, regulation, and so on. And that's where we're kind of stuck right now. The emissions reduction plan is hovering there in the air, but now what we need is in each single sector to say, well, what would you need to move forward with that? How long would it take to get planning approval for that? How many people do we need to make those retrofits? And so on and so on.
And with supply, how do you bring with the technology? How do you make sure it's available? All these kind of questions.
And I think, there's an awful lot of commentators that did land on this notion of it's about implementation now, right? I mean, this is the phase that we're in. So I'm going to make one comment, and then I'm going to go to the audience Q&A. So look, when we framed up this webinar series, we said to ourselves, like, we're all sick of going to conferences where there are panels that are dominated by scripted questions with scripted answers. Like, we need to be a little bit more edgy, frankly, a little bit more forthcoming, and in the solution space. And I'm just gonna make an observation. There are a couple of comments in the chat session here that draw into question the science of climate change. This is not the forum for you. There are probably other places you can go and talk and debate that. This is not it. Go somewhere else. So back to the solution space now. That's my edgy part of the of things. Okay, I've some really great questions. Here's one from Deborah Lobo, and I really respect you putting your name in, Deborah. She says, "What is your opinion on cogeneration using fossil fuels, and whether this represents a dead-end pathway that you spoke of?" So is cogen using fossil fuels a dead-end pathway? I've actually got an opinion on this, but I'll turn to Ramon and James for an opinion first.
From a technological point of view, it's a dead end unless you do carbon capture and sequestration. Because if you invest in these technologies without removing the carbon, you're still emitting. And going to net zero, our modeling showed that it's extremely hard to get to net zero. Even if you use clean electricity all over the board, you still, because of agriculture, because of industrial processes, because of a few sectors where we don't have the technology, we would still need to capture and sequester 150 million tons of CO2 every year in 2050 in our modeling. That's about a bit less than a quarter of the emissions in Canada today. So this is huge. So if you start piling up, let's keep gas for making electricity, let's keep gas for this, or we don't get to net zero.
Let me sort of riff on that a little bit. I know a little bit about the plan to net zero that the oil sands companies and their alliance have. And first of all, I would say that those companies, they deserve an awful lot of credit. They're basically the first sector out of the gate in Canada that has a plan. They've developed a sectoral plan to get to net zero. That's a great thing. I think part of the challenge with that is that it's a bit of the Wild West out there. And one of the issues that I see with that plan is that they are defining their own boundary conditions about what their sector is. And at least some of the companies are relying on them bringing on more cogen electricity. So this is making electricity using natural gas for them to use to make oil. But then they also want to sell this electricity onto the Alberta grid. Now, the existing Alberta grid is actually quite dirty. It's not clean electricity. So if they were to bring on cogen electricity, sell it onto the Alberta grid, there would be a delta. There would be potentially a decrease in emissions. And what at least some of the companies want to do is claim that emissions reduction as part of their decarbonization plan for their company and for their sector. So it's sort of like an offset. But here's the problem: if you're allowed to set the boundary conditions for how what equation use for net zero, and they're allowed to claim a net decrease because of they're getting into the clean electricity business, there's still emissions going up their stack. And who's going to account for those? So we run we're into this stage of planning where sectors and companies can't really define their own boundary conditions. If that happens, we could have this mishmash and meshing of sectoral and company net zero plans that at the scale of the company or their sector is net zero, but Canada can't get to net zero. So I think there's a real issue here in terms of not just the concept of decreasing emissions, but how those emissions reductions and feed into the net zero equation for a sector or a company, and whether or not they're allowed to, for example, become regulatory compliant in the upcoming emissions reduction regulation for the oil and gas sector the federal government will bring out. I think it's a really serious issue, and I see real big problems just conceptually, because again, net zero changes everything. In emissions reduction paradigm, that's great, emissions are reduced, but you can't get to net zero if every sector defines their own boundary conditions for the reduction plans. So, James, maybe
I would just go to the next question, because I could riff in on there too, but let's have a variety of questions.
Yeah, look, here's one that's actually, I think, really important. And so I talked about this notion of a dead-end pathway that is fundamental to the Transition Accelerator methodology. It's described in detail in that foundational document I pointed to at the beginning of the presentation. And I'll also say that the Net Zero Advisory Body that I co-chair has adopted this framing of dead-end pathways being important to avoid. But how do we understand what's a dead end and what isn't? That seems to be pretty important. Any thoughts?
Go ahead, James.
Yeah. Okay. So I would say that obviously this demands analysis, and to some extent it is context dependent. So at a certain point of time, we may be able to say something is a dead end pathway that maybe wasn't clear 5 years earlier or 10 years earlier. I think the key thing is you need to keep in mind, on one hand, what is the end point? What does a net zero future look like? Where we are today, and then the potential of various technologies combined with business models to move you from one to another. In the Net Zero Pathways report that we issued a little bit more than a year ago, we actually had 3 criteria for saying that something kind of could contribute positively to net zero. One was, of course, the most simple thing. That's a technology that could exist in a net zero world. So something like an electric vehicle is such a technology, provided the electricity is decarbonized, and of course, provided the supply chain for building the cars is also decarbonized. So that means steel production, the battery production, and so on. But there were 2 other categories we included. We talked about technologies that could be a necessary technological or business step to get to net zero. So there might be things that we embrace, even though they're not fully net zero, but because they're part of a step, they allow you to roll out the technology, which then you can tweak further or whatever. And the third one was something that would accelerate. So it might be a policy measure or something that would accelerate the process of change. So those were the 3 kind of dimensions that we should say. So here's a good example of how you can see something doesn't fit. 20 years ago, it was kind of unclear how quickly battery technology would evolve, and people talked about different options for light-duty vehicles. So biofuels, fuel cells, batteries, and so on. The point where we are today, it is absolutely clear that the light-duty vehicle market, pickups, vans, cars, is moving to full battery electrification. Fuel cells may be interesting, but particularly for heavy-duty vehicles, maybe some fleets, but it's all about the battery electric vehicles. It is moreover clear that corn-based ethanol or ethanol, blends or full ethanol for light-duty vehicles is simply not a viable pathway. There isn't enough land. We need our biofuels for other things. They're competing uses in the chemical industry, aviation, and stuff that are far more ways to use this precious resource. So any program that is actively financing the investment in in these sorts of biofuels for light duty transport is simply pouring money down a dead end pathway. And I got to say this, Ontario is still proudly announcing an extension of its biofuels ethanol blend with gasoline program and counting on that. In fact, I believe it is the largest supposed to be the largest contributor to the 2030 goals of the province of Ontario. And that is just, totally misplaced investment. So I agree. There are some areas where it's complicated. We'll debate and we'll look at, what can that give? Is it really a dead end or not? There are other things that are now completely clear, and we shouldn't be investing in them.
And I would say other dead ends that are sometimes more subtle is those that raise the barrier to transformation. For example, energy efficiency to use more efficiently fossil fuels. So the investments you put in this lock you deeper in fossil fuels usage, for example, for two reasons. First, you made the investment, and second, it reduces the cost of energy associated with fossil fuels, so you can tolerate a higher tax on carbon and things like this. And this really is a hurdle to making this transformation. So it's better to make the transformation efficiently towards zero carbon than to just invest in measures that will decrease the cost of using fossil fuels and that lock you in much further, much deeper in these structures, and that in the end represent dead end because you're not making this transformation needed. You're not building the market, you're not decreasing the cost to these low carbon technologies.
Dan, I saw a question that just went across my screen. Am I allowed to answer it? It was on.
I'll pass the moderator speaking stick to you, James. Go ahead.
No, this was, there was one question about battery materials, and it just said, are we going to run out of the minerals for batteries and so on? And is that an obstacle? And I just wanted to say that for electric vehicles, in the short term, there can be supply constraints on these materials. But over the medium to long term, it's very unlikely that will be a constraining factor. One reason is because the research on batteries is continuing. One of the major objectives of GM and other companies is, for example, to get cobalt out of the battery supply chain. They are moving also on other minerals that are either scarce or only available from a few countries or whatever. And also historically, these sorts of resource constraints have been consistently overcome as we find substitute materials and so on. So I wouldn't panic now that, oh my goodness, we're going to run out of materials, therefore EVs aren't the way to go. No, we'll develop new battery chemistries and we can unroll that. But right now, particularly with the geopolitical situation and so on, there can be short-term constraints. And one other little question that came across my screen was, did we get rid of coal too early? No, we didn't. Coal is the most carbon-intensive fuel. And generally, I would say from a political science perspective, as opposed from kind of an economic perspective, you want to concentrate the blow, get rid of the most dirty, polluting fuels, and or focus on the most important sectors. So getting rid of coal in Ontario was probably the biggest contribution yet in Canada to decarbonization, and we should continue to accelerate this in all provinces.
There's a fair bit of chatter on the questions about carbon capture and storage. I'm just going to flag that the Transition Accelerator with local leaders and governments has launched Canada's first hydrogen hub in Edmonton, the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub. It also has a webinar series, and we're gearing up for a couple of carbon capture and storage webinars, the technology, the philosophy, the policy, and so on. So let's not deal with that there, but I'll point people to follow us on or the Edmonton Region Hydrogen Hub and find out when those CCUS webinars to have those questions answered. We've got 10 minutes left. Probably time for 3 or 4 more questions. Look, here's one from, I think, an insightful commentator, and this is, frankly, aligns with the Transition Accelerator methodology, which is this transition is not all downside, right? There are remarkable upsides, and we need to seize those upsides. So what are Canada's advantages globally in this transition? Thoughts?
I think we have to realize that we focus a lot on energy, for example, energy production, but we put a lot of money and a lot of expenses and a lot of jobs are outside of this. So in some way, as we reshuffle, clearly, for example, if the demand in oil and gas over the world goes down, we'll export less. So you need to find other markets, but these markets might not be in green technologies, the standard technology. If we make video games, for example, and Canada increases the number of jobs in that market, that's low carbon, okay? So that's a green technology. So we have to make sure that as we make these investments, as we decarbonize some technologies, we don't get stuck in this very narrow view of we change one job for oil and gas into one job for wind or solar or other energy. What we have to do is find markets and find ways to move forward. And in that sense, there will not be in food, agriculture. We see the tensions today. We see these needs. There will be a lot of development for Canada on that side. There's also natural resources if we want to keep in this. But there's a lot of secondary and tertiary markets. So we have absolutely to open up and say what we want tomorrow is a prosperous Canada with low impact, not only in terms of GHG, but low environmental impact. And that transforms a lot of what we're doing.
Yeah, maybe I could just add that if people look at the Accelerator website, I think you'll find a report that we just put out actually a few weeks ago. The lead author was Bentley Allen, and it's looking at kind of industrial strategy and green industrial strategy for Canada going forward. And I think it could provide a more detailed answer for this. But it shows that there are a number of sectors. It's principally focused on the resource-based sectors where Canada could be internationally competitive. The challenge is for Canada, which is a medium-sized country with an open economy, what sort of sectors should we be investing in going forward? And there are a number of opportunities that are listed there.
So, maybe I'll just sort of pile on there, James, this notion of, what are Canada's advantages in the future really should be a very formal question that we ask with a very formal deliberate analysis and very formal answers to that question about how to strategically position Canada into the future. And we do have these inherent advantages right from natural resources up to being technology leaders for sure. But this notion of an industrial strategy where we deliberately position Canada in the future has got to be a key thing for us in the country. So, okay, a couple more here, winding down. Here's one. I'll paraphrase. This is from Peter Koenig. And it's this idea that most of our effort seems to be put on trying to reduce emissions around the supply side of energy instead of reducing the use of emitting energy or to change demand. I'm going to throw it to you two, but I actually think that might be a little bit dated. I mean, that certainly is the paradigm that we took in an emissions reduction paradigm. It was about energy. But when I take a look at that emissions reduction plan that the government has come out with, like taking internal combustion engines off the road, that is a pretty strong demand side prescription. So any thoughts on this idea of whether we should be focusing more of our attention or whether it's even real that we're not focusing attention on demand side change as opposed to supply side?
I would well, go ahead, James.
No, I was going to say you kick it off, Noel.
Okay. So, I think that's an issue environmental groups have put a lot of focus on oil and gas emissions from the production sector, which is about a quarter of the total emissions in Canada. That means that 3/4 that are somewhere else. And I agree that we absolutely need to focus our attention on emissions from the consumption service, because if there's no demand for oil and gas, the production will align itself. If we keep the demand, even if we shrink the production here, we'll have to import it from somewhere else. So it's clear we have to do this. But in a transformation where we need to get to net zero and where Canada has set itself with targets, reduction targets in 2030 and others, we have also to see how we can reach these targets. And to reach these targets, clearly, one of the easier fruit to catch is the one linked to the production of oil and gas. So we're kind of facing that as Canada, if we want to move forward, we have to reduce. Some of the faster reductions are in productions, but we absolutely need to focus on the other sectors. Otherwise, we are not out of the wood.
I mean, there are two sectors whose emissions are markedly growing, and that is the emissions from oil and gas
Transportation,
and transportation. Those are the two. Most other are fairly stable, or fact, our electricity emissions are like dramatically decreased. So when I actually take a look at the current federal government's prescriptions in the ERP that seem to single out transportation with zero emission vehicle mandates, and seem to single out capping and putting in regulatory emissions reduction targets for the oil and gas sector. There's actually logic about why they're pointing to those sectors. It's the two that are increasing. And, one of the first steps of addressing a problem is not making it worse. So, strong federal prescriptions on those two sectors seem to make sense to me.
Yeah, but
So
you also need to hit. Go
I
ahead.
could just add one last thing. Implicit or maybe another interpretation of that question is the relationship between how much emphasis you put on industry and business and how much you put on consumers and the behavior of individuals and so on. And I would say that, when we look at these big transformations that we've seen historically, many things are involved. There is the aspect that, the material aspect of the technology and the infrastructure. There's also regulation, there's changes in business models, but there's also important changes in consumer behavior. And I think in different parts of the decarbonization problem, these elements will be combined in different ways. So if you want to sell lots of electric vehicles, consumers have to buy electric vehicles. So that actually will require changes of behavior in the way people refuel their vehicles, plan their journeys and things like that. And the same with transformations in the built environment, transformations of diets and agri-food sector and so on. So I think that these are production consumption systems linked with a hyphen and linked with material and financial flows. And you have to pay attention ultimately to all sides of the thing. But in a particular context, one bit of it may move the dial most quickly or be the most important obstacle to remove in a particular context.
If I may disagree a bit, because at least
Oh, come on.
I think
Go
we
for it,
cannot the citizen has directly fairly little control. In Canada, citizens are responsible for about directly 22% of the emissions, 78%. So 4/5 of the emissions in Canada are linked to industry, businesses, and out of the hand of the citizen. So clearly, in the end, the citizen buys the house, but the citizen has no control on how the house is built largely. How is this concrete built? What's the emission linked to this? So yes, in the end, it comes to the consumer, but what has to be happening is away from the consumer in regulation, in constraints, what choices are being offered, how we manage the technologies, and that's in the end, outside of the hand of the citizens.
It strikes me that one of the other differences between an emissions reduction paradigm and an elimination paradigm, that for 30 years, the whole country has been looking to the federal minister of environment and climate change to come up with a plan and frankly make it worth their while to act. That's basically what people have said, is like, put in place the policies or I'm not going to act. But in an emissions elimination paradigm, like, not getting this right isn't an option. And I think that is going to require us all to take a look at our roles, the roles of government, the roles of industry, even our personal roles, because to get this right, we all have to lead and all have to assume some type of responsibility. And I think we're just in that inflection point now from emissions reduction to emissions elimination paradigm. And with that, James, Normand, I really appreciate this. Our time is up. Thank you very much for everyone that joined us. Thanks for the questions. I learned an awful lot. Please sign off now with a clean conscience, but we're going to probably keep chattering just for a little bit if people want to stick around informally. So thanks very much. Look for us, follow us on social media for the topic of our next webinar. Thanks all.
So if I can just add something to what you were saying.
This is why I knew you were thinking, but we've got to stick around. So, okay.
No, I don't fully agree with you. I think citizens, people, and businesses and others have a lot of reasons, a lot of constraints, a lot of issues that they have to deal. They cannot on every day be asked to deal with the transformation transition. So what we need is a very strong message, political message from the government with actions, with plans, with regulations that shows that's the direction we go. So when, as a citizen or a business owner, I have to make a decision, I don't have to deal with, should I go gas or electricity or whatever? The message and the direction is strong enough that my choice is already written for me. And that's how we can work. We cannot ask for everybody to become an expert at the energy transition.
So Normand, I actually agree with that completely. I mean, you cannot have it that, I know some colleagues in Sweden set up these energy clubs where everybody in the housing estate comes together every week to compare their energy use and things like that. So, I mean, that's fine for militants. You can't ask ordinary people who are trying to manage their lives, their children, their everything to do this. But I do think that all sorts of things like that can play a role in raising kind of awareness of a problem, and also in building a background public opinion that's needed to support some of the kinds of measures and top-down rules and things that you're dealing with. So I don't believe, as some of my activist colleagues believe, that we should if we convince everybody to be vegan, we'll solve the problem of animal agriculture. But on the other hand, do I believe that the question about, I do believe that discussing diets, making people understand why animal agriculture as it's currently conducted is a problem, is important. And, no doubt there are aspects of consumer behavior that are parts of the solution. So I'm pushing back a bit, but I agree fundamentally it's a system, and individuals have limited ability to change that system. As you said, it's hard to quibble about the composition of the cement of the house you're building. But on the other hand, there are things like certification programs, regulation, and so on, which can enforce that houses are built to a better standard.
Normally, aren't we minimizing the power of the consumer though? And also with that, maybe minimizing the opportunity that we have to change consumer preferences. So, I just take a look
Those are two things you're saying, okay?
But aren't they
when you
linked?
look at the advertisements there are for the big trucks and SUVs,
Yeah.
this is a way to modify the consumer
Yeah.
decisions, okay? But that costs billions of dollars, and it's being done, repeated every 5 times an hour, okay? That's the type of challenges, because people cannot make informed decisions all the time. So you have to kind of orient that.
Isn't that also, I mean, that's sort of my point though, isn't it an opportunity to try to influence consumer behavior? I know in France that they have laws where advertisers have to provide basically emissions reduction advertising components, and auto manufacturers, I mean, they have to advertise essentially the implications of their products that they're trying to flog on emissions. So, when I take a look at the private sector, I mean, they're masters at getting people to buy things, to exercise their consumer preferences in ways that are aligned with a value, right? Buy my product, you'll be
No,
cool.
you align
Buy
the
my product,
values
you'll
and
be
the
sexy.
problem. You're aligning the values. That's
Right.
the whole work, is how do you change the values of the
Okay, I think we're agreeing then.
So the citizens, to me, if we don't want people to buy big trucks, don't make them allow or tax them to the roof. I mean, this is what you do.
And
If
that's
you
happening. Yeah.
Yeah, I mean, so I'm watching some of the things in the chat go by really quickly. And somebody was making the point that consumers have time and consumers have financial power. The other thing is we've used two words, consumers and citizens. And of course, citizens have, when we're thinking about citizens, they have political power as well, potentially. Limited in our form of democracy, but they can at least, vote, and they can protest, and they can, do various things. So, one of the most important things when we're talking about the individuals is really to demand that their politicians have serious approach to this whole question of long-term decarbonization. So I just throw that into the mix as well. So Dan, do you have some other topics too while we're?
No, look, this is going to sound weird. I actually have to run. I've got another meeting here. I've got about 5 more minutes. But, just let me make an observation here. Maybe we can go even more informal now that the whole damn event is over. But like this, Normand, when you brought up this idea of like, what is the role of the citizen? Really, how could they be empowered? How are they empowered? That has sparked a remarkable amount of comments here. So this could actually be a topic, I think, for even a next session here that sort of gets to, I think, a real strategic point in this whole transition, which is
So with
Yeah, because there's
my-
some very important point
right.
that I don't have time to say, but no, that are so crucial.
yeah.
So with my students, this is one of the issues that they're most interested in discussing. And I saw, again, in this flow of constant chat, somebody said they couldn't see the government banning SUVs. Well, I completely agree. I couldn't see a Canadian government banning SUVs, but I could see them banning the sale of an internal combustion SUV. And that will happen. I think that's inevitable. In the final phase of the movement to electric vehicles, there will simply be, you can't sell these anymore, and then at one point you can't drive them without a particular permit because it's a vintage car or something like that. Think about how we got rid of leaded gasoline. And these sorts of phase outs are a feature of many historical transitions, and that is possible.
Normand, I'm just going to, someone called Blythe Butler agreed with you 1,000%. So that's actually really strong alignment, I got to tell you.
Nobody.
Thanks, Blythe. Yeah.
Well, thanks a lot to all.
Look, maybe we'll call it there, fellas.
Yep.
And I also think that maybe the next one we could do an hour and a half. Let's talk with Jess Harris, our comms person, see if that would work as well. So thanks to everyone. This is the real sign off and the real end. We've still got 80 people on here. We'd actually love to hear from people, what you liked about it, what you'd like improved. Send us comments on info@transitionaccelerator.ca. And thanks, James, Normand. We will
Hi, thanks.
see you soon. Thanks all.